You can almost hear it. The tick, tick, tick as the disgraced, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president slowly runs out of time to post that massive, nearly $500 million bond in a civil fraud case. Donald Trump has until Monday at midnight to make it happen or face the consequences. Consequences that could put his pride and joy, his real estate empire, in the crosshairs. Estates, hotels, golf courses, the iconic Trump Tower, all properties valued by the Trump org at a much higher level than appraisers valued them, as revealed in the civil fraud trial. And all of them now potentially fair game for New York Attorney General Tish James to seize if Trump fails to meet his financial obligation by the deadline. With time running out, NBC News is reporting the former president has grown, quote, frustrated and has now resorted to, quote, hitting up high-dollar donors, not just for campaign cash, but also to see whether they might guarantee his bond. They say the ex-president is huddled up with advisors, quote, gaming out options, including ways Trump could appeal Judge Engoron's ruling without having to put the bond up, and what would happen if they can't secure the required sum. Sources also tell NBC News that Trump's team believes that, quote, seizing Trump's assets or liquidating them at fire sale prices could prove to be rocket fuel for his campaign. But there does appear to be one clear way out: bankruptcy. An option that the Washington Post reports Trump is resisting out of concern that it could hurt his reelection bid. Quote, even though bankruptcy could alleviate his immediate cash crunch, it also carries risks for a candidate who has marketed himself as a winning businessman and whose greatest appeal to voters, some advisors say, is his financial success. As Tim O'Brien, who wrote the definitive biography of the disgraced ex-president, put it, quote, this is Trump's worst nightmare. And if that wasn't enough to give Donald Trump nightmares, consider this. Bloomberg is reporting that New York Attorney General James has formally registered Trump's civil fraud judgment with the Westchester County Clerk. Now, that might sound innocuous, but it allows the New York AG to, quote, more easily secure liens, should she decide to do so, on 2 of Trump's most valuable properties, Trump National Golf Club in Westchester and the 212-acre Seven Springs estate. The clock, again, is ticking. And that is where we start today with former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman, plus former Republican Congressman and MSNBC political analyst David Jolly. And with me at the table, Senior Executive Editor at Bloomberg Opinion and MSNBC political analyst Tim O'Brien is here. Harry, bankruptcy, it would be the 7th time, I think, Trump declared bankruptcy, an option he doesn't want right now, even though you have the Post reporting that a bankruptcy filing by Trump personally or by one of his companies could delay for months or years the requirement that he pay the judgment. A federal judge could be charged with the time-consuming task of determining how and when each of his creditors, including the state, would be paid. That sounds like a win for Trump, given his desire for delay there, Harry.
It's a win for the old Trump. I don't think for the current candidate, Trump. He's done it, as you say, 6 times in the past. It freezes the linebackers more like for years, Alicia, while everything is sifted through. It gets all the pressure off. He runs the campaign. But I think there's a political close to imperative not to do it. The other thing he doesn't want to do is have Tish James decide what she's going to go after. So first, I just want to say the clock is ticking, but these contests have a way sometimes of going into overtime, and there may still be some maneuvers left. For starters, the appellate court might reduce the amount. He might ask James for a bit more time. But I think if push really comes to shove, for political reasons, he'll want to avoid bankruptcy, and for financial and sort of pride reasons, he won't want James to have her pick of his crown jewels, so he'll wind up selling things, but not 40 Wall Street, not Bedminster, before the Grim Reaper literally comes down. But even if she moves on properties, he still has legal maneuvers to do. But that, I think, will be his 2 kind of guideposts. Don't declare bankruptcy, and don't let her choose what she's going after first.
Tim, do you agree?
Well, I think we should get kind of clear on the various timeframes here, because it's not like he can just push a bankruptcy button,
sure,
or just sell some assets. And If there's an extension of the time frame, if the court grants him that, if the appellate court intervenes in some unusual way beyond the petitions he's already made, I suppose the timeline could get drawn out. But I imagine that Tish James is ready to do this at dawn on Monday morning if she needs to.
What an image.
Yeah. And the other thing, you know, if he wants to put this through the bankruptcy court, he'll have to petition the court. Those are often dense, fairly complicated filings. He would have already had to have set that in motion, I would think, if he's going to do that. Maybe he has, but we've seen no indication that he has. The other thing that I find kind of humorous in all this is this idea that he would want her to seize his assets because thereby he could own the libs. And with this idea somehow that they would put a chain around Trump Tower, or someone would pick up 40 Wall Street and move it and stick it in Tish James's pocket. And most of this will be paper shuffling. It'll be digital transactions. There won't be the kind of public drama he thrives on to show that he's being persecuted as he did in the courtroom, which is why he showed up in the courtroom.
So, David, just to put a fine point on what Tim just said there, this from the Washington Post, this is what Trump land is saying. He'd rather have Letitia James show up with the sheriff at 40 Wall Street and make a huge stink about it than say he's bankrupt. He thinks about what is going to play politically well for him. Bankruptcy doesn't play well for him, but having her try to take his properties away might. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think give Donald Trump some more time to reconsider bankruptcy because, listen, he can flip a script on anybody and his followers will believe whatever he says. And the reality is bankruptcy is really the best option for Donald Trump and gives him the best ability to really delay actual consequences, which is his complete strategy. Because otherwise, Donald Trump is in a situation, but so is the nation, Alicia, where sometime in the next week, someone's likely going to own Donald Trump. And it could be a bad actor, a foreign actor. It could be a Putin, an MBS. It could be an Elon Musk. Or it could be Letitia James in the state of New York. But if Donald Trump is looking at actually having someone else now in control of his assets, yes, Donald Trump can use that for grievance, but he really doesn't like that scenario because without real estate, who is Donald Trump? I mean, in some ways, his real estate empire, at least the image of it, is bigger than his own presidency. So you don't know. I think let's give Donald Trump a little bit of time to think about the bankruptcy option. He can play politically whatever he needs to, and his followers will buy it.
Tim, you told the Washington Post, quote, Donald Trump's worst nightmare from a personal and financial situation. That's what you called this case. And you think we can expect him to only get angrier and more aggressive. That is the Trump of it all. There's also what David's saying, though, which is the real threat here are people who might want to gain influence over Donald Trump.
Right. I mean, he's a national security threat, and he was when he was in the White House the first time around. We know through some congressional investigations that he got at least, I think, $70 million or so from foreign entities through his hotel in Washington. He was trying to do a deal in Moscow when he was running for president. That would explain why he was trying to court Vladimir Putin so closely. It's always about dollar signs in his eyes. The difference between, I think, his first tour through the Oval Office and a potential new tour is that he's under much more financial duress. And he's clearly scrambling to try to find a solution to this current financial problem. And that makes him a mark for any foreign entity that wants to have influence in the White House, and they can get it pretty cheaply. Jared Kushner got $2 billion from the Saudis for an investment fund on a very thin track record as an investor. And I think a lot of people watching that assumed it was simply the Saudis currying favor with the Trump White House. And I think that comes into play now, and I think voters should be aware of it. I think there's little that can be done to stop it. Right now he's a private citizen. He's running for president, but he will have intelligence briefings after the nomination, and I think it's a real problem that this financial situation presents.
Harry, there's another element here, which is Judge Engoron issued an order today strengthening the powers of the court-appointed monitor. What does that tell you?
Well, first, it tells me something we already knew. He doesn't really trust Trump. Trump is trying to use it to his advantage to say all the guarantees that you need are already in place. So it'll be an argument to the Court of Appeals here to try to actually, cut him some slack. But look, bankruptcy. He's done it before and doesn't hesitate. I just think it's a political problem. And then we know that his commercial real estate holdings well exceed the amount of the bond. And so there are things that he could sell off. Although, as Tim and David point out, there's a real risk here, and he's even he's going to kind of billionaire buddies at home and abroad. He is that poses a real risk. It's always been a risk, but it's nothing that the law prevents. I just think he has more cards up his sleeve, and before he lets Tish James, actually at the few properties that he considers define him as a real estate magnate.
Maybe. Because I also think it's interesting, David, the fact that none of those so-called billionaire friends have come to his rescue just yet, right? I mean, they seem to understand the potential liability that they are dealing with.
Yeah, that's right. First of all, $500 million is a lot of money to come up with, even for billionaires, particularly when you're a billionaire with illiquid assets, which is essentially the case that Donald Trump is making. And also, look, one of the factors of bankruptcy court is he could always exit bankruptcy court, right? He could pull off some type of outside lending and ultimately exit bankruptcy court. It is cumbersome. It is complex. Certainly, you don't want to enter that process if he can avoid it. I think one of the ironies is, we see him play victim, but then we also see him really shout victimhood sometimes where he's personally offended. And this filing has all of the victimhood of Donald Trump when he says it would be patently unfair. His lawyers say it would be patently unfair to have him have to quickly liquidate these real estate assets. They are iconic. He would have to sell them at a discount. Well, you know what, lawyers? It is exactly fair, because it's these assets that are essentially at the subject of his fraud. It is these assets that he used and manipulated his financial statements to get leverage so he could own these assets. So there is a bit of irony, but it's also patently fair if indeed Tish James takes some of these properties as a result of this judgment.
We're just